And we're delighted to have joining with us today Miles Rapoport, who is the Senior Practice Fellow in American Democracy at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. He formerly served in the Connecticut State Legislature as the Secretary of the State. He also served as president of Demos and of Common Cause. He is co-author with E.J. Dionne of 100% Democracy. We also have joining us E.J. Dionne. He is author of Code Red, How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country, and co-author with Miles Rapoport of 100% Democracy, which we'll be talking about today. EJ is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, a university professor at Georgetown University, and a visiting professor at Harvard University. Thank you so much for joining us, Miles and EJ.
What a joy. It's great to be with you.
So EJ, I wonder if you can start us off by talking about why you decided to write this book.
Yeah, it came from several sources. First, I had spent a lot of time over the years in Australia and had seen their system of universal voting work very well. And so that initially got me into this, to the point where, and Miles will mention this perhaps a little later, my colleague Bill Galston and I wrote a Brookings paper about 7 years ago recommending this system. But I also came to it because I see it as an answer, a way through our current voting wars. And as Miles and I will be arguing in the course of this podcast, we think the best way to defend democracy as a right is to insist on it as a legal and civic duty. If you do that, if you adopt a system like Australia's, then a lot of the barriers to voting would fall, because it would necessarily be the case that a system that requires everyone to vote would have to make it as easy as possible for everyone to do their civic duty. And in our book, as you know, we propose a series of gateway reforms to make it easier for people to vote. And that's exactly what Australia did. We came to this also because of dissatisfactions in the various ways in which our democratic system is working now. I like to say that our current election system is like a fancy dinner party, where you have, at fancy dinner parties, you have an A list and a B list and a C list. The A list are the people you really want, and the B and the C list you turn to as a last resort. In our voting system, there is an A list of likely voters who get all of the attention from the politicians, all of the attention from their consultants, all kinds of mail and social media communications. Essentially, the A list is constantly invited and asked to vote. Also, the people on the A list who are in the other party are barraged with really nasty messages trying to keep them home. And we also now have proposals that have passed in various states that are designed to keep the other side's A list from being voting at all. In the meantime, you've got the B list of registered voters who don't vote often, and a C list of people who aren't registered, who get remarkably little attention from our campaigns and from our political leaders. And one of the things we know from good political science research is people are more likely to do something if you ask them to do it. And the people on the B and the C lists are not asked to vote, are not invited to vote. And so we see our system of universal voting modeled broadly after Australia's, although, as we'll talk, it's been in effect in about 24 other countries. But we think the Australia model, with 100 years of proof of concept, you don't get many ideas that have that long a proof of concept. We think that system would be a message to everyone that everyone should be part of our great experiment in democracy.
Miles, you've been involved in voting and election issues for a long time in several different roles, both in the nonprofit organizations you've served, as well as in state government. I'm curious if you could speak to what made you decide to embrace this idea of universal voting.
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I think about a lot, and I'm very glad about. So I'll go back and start. I realized recently that I have been working on voting rights issues and expanding democracy and campaign finance reform and gerrymandering reform for just about 40 years, both in the legislature and as Secretary of the State, then as president of Demos and as president of Common Cause. And so, I have worked on almost all of the kind of various reforms that people who are working on, who believe in voting, expanding voting, have worked on, from same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, restoration of voting rights to people have felony convictions who have been barred from voting previously, expanded mail-in voting, expanded early voting, all of those things. And I believe in them. I believe in them all. And I think they really have worked. They've obviously worked enough so that there is now a fiercely determined movement to roll all of it back, which we see in the voter suppression laws that are being passed in a number of states. But I realized maybe 5 or 6 years ago that, for all the work that I and, thousands of other people have done on these issues, we haven't moved the needle very far. I looked at the 2018 turnout figures and the 2020 turnout figures, and the 2018 turnout was the highest in memory, probably ever. And it was at 50.3% of the eligible voters. And in 2020, which credit to the whole election administrators and election system in the middle of a pandemic, we managed to pull off, what should have been a cause for celebration, a high level of voting under all those difficult circumstances. And even that was at 66.2%. So, I thought, all right, so all of these things have made a difference and they're worth working for, but what could really be a game changer? What really might move the needle, not from, 56 to 58%, but up to 90%. So we really could look at having really genuinely full participation. And then I read an article that this person named E.J. Dionne had written for the Brookings Institution, along with his colleague, William Galston, which made the case that we should adopt the Australian style of compulsory participation in the polls, or universal voting, I think is a better, more precise term for it for us. And I thought, wow, this is really, really an interesting idea. It's a really good idea. It's been in Australia for 100 years and other countries for decades. And yet here I have been working on these issues for 40 years, and I've never been in a conversation about this as a possible policy. And that made me really angry, frankly, and determined to, get into it and see whether this has any viability, because it really would make a huge difference. So then I was able to enlist EJ to co-chair this working group that was a joint project of the Brookings Institution and the Ash Center. And we did a report back in 2020 called Lift Every Voice, the Urgency of Universal Civic Duty Voting. That then attracted the attention of the new press. Diane Wachtel, the executive director of this wonderful nonpartisan nonprofit publishing company, who said she really, really wanted a book about that. So EJ and I eagerly agreed, and it's been a labor of love. I should say working with EJ on this has been one of the kind of huge collateral benefits of being involved in the issue. But I guess the short answer to sum that all up, Abe, sorry to go on so long, is that, this is an opportunity. This policy, if it is seriously discussed and embraced, whether that's at the federal level or at the state level, or even in some municipalities, has the possibility to leap over the kind of brittle debates over, should we expand early voting to 15 days or contract it to 8 days, that we've been having, and we really wanted to kind of put a North Star out there to say, we can imagine a situation, we can imagine a country, we can imagine democracy in which everyone is participating, or almost everyone is participating. That would be a good thing. If you believe in democracy, that's a really good thing.
Let me ask a quick follow-up. Oh, sorry, Kara.
Go ahead.
Let me ask a quick follow-up for either one of you. The United States has notoriously low voter turnout rates relative to many other democracies. EJ, you spoke about the A list, B list, and C list. We know that many people aren't voting. Can you speak to, to me, when I think about the problem of low voter turnout, we also know that who's in that A, B, and C list isn't necessarily a representative sample across those of us in the United States, but there's really demographic differences and socioeconomic differences as it relates to who's participating and who isn't. So in defining the problem of the low voter turnout that we have here, how does that affect questions about public policy and representation?
Well, thank you for that. By the way, I want to return the favor to Miles. I have loved working with him. There are two things I always say about Miles. One, quite relevant to the book and what comes after. The first is Miles has so much energy that if Europe could just tap Miles, they would never have to import another drop of Russian oil. And the second thing I say about Miles is that he's such an inveterate organizer that when he goes to heaven, he will immediately organize the angels into a union. And I would love to see the theological issues raised when Miles leads a collective bargaining with God. But that's relevant because Miles, and we can talk about this later, Miles is organizing the 100% Democracy Initiative, where this is a book that where we advance this argument. But we're also committed to seeing this idea adopted, probably over time, probably first at the state and local level. But Miles has already started doing some organizing on this, and that's a great thing. On your point, there are several problems we have with voter turnout that I think are particular to us. One is that our registration system is far more difficult than it has to be. One of the reasons we like the Australian system is because they have a streamlined voter registration system that gets 96% of Australians registered. And I have, she's honored in the book. I had a great research assistant named Amber Hurley who was researching what Australia does to help people register and vote. And she came into my office all excited and said, you got to see all the cool things Australia does to make it easier for people to register and vote. We should do that. And we think we should do that. And that creates one of the particular holes in the electorate, which is that the young are very much underrepresented in the electorate. We have the figures in the book, which I will try to rifle through and find quickly. But we, young people move around a whole lot more than older people do. Older people are settled. Our system makes it much easier if you're settled and registered in the same place to vote in election after election. And that is, by the way, I think for the young, same-day voter registration is one of the most important reforms you can have. Just to give the numbers, even in 2020, where the young vote went up, according to the Census Bureau figures, 18 to 29's 54%, 65 plus is 74.5. So there you have one of the big holes in the electorate. A second big hole is by class, and using education as a rough indicator of class. Again, 2020, high turnout among all groups, relatively speaking. Less than a high school diploma, 41.5%, bachelor's degree, 77.9%, advanced degree, 83%. That's a huge gap that we have. And also, Black voter turnout is a little lower than white turnout, although it's been on the upswing, but Latino and Asian American turnout is significantly lower. Those are kind of the biggest holes in our electorate in terms of participation. And by the way, those numbers should give some reassurance to people who argue, well, these guys or anybody who wants to increase voting is only trying to elect Democrats perpetually. Two things about that. One, this idea actually came originally from the conservative side of Australian politics because they were worried about the power of organized labor, the union movement. They felt that maybe the Labor Party in Australia would win every election. And Labor looked at the system and said, no, we think we can do just fine under this system. And Australia has had great transfer of power back and forth between one party and another. It looks like in the current election, a week coming up soon, that that Labor will oust conservatives who've been in power for a long time. But look at your own state of Virginia. The Democrats, when they were in power in Virginia, made it much easier to vote, helped produce a huge turnout for the 2021 election. And the Republicans swept all three statewide elected offices. So we think people in both parties have to give up the idea that high turnout automatically equals Democratic victories. And because there are various holes in the electorate and they kind of balance each other out to some degree. And besides, voting isn't static. People change their minds over time. Look at the variation in the Latino vote since 2000 as a good example. So you can't predict from that. And that's good because we're not in this because we're trying to fix the outcome of elections. We're in this because we want an inclusive democracy.
So you both have referred to universal civic voting as, essentially being able to put an end to many of the legal assaults on voting rights. And we see that in many states across the country, and I think you both have referred to this already, but there are at least 250 restrictive voting bills in 27 legislatures. 49 bills have been introduced this year that would undermine the electoral process. And we also see other states where there are more expansive provisions that have been introduced in state legislatures. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about how you see universal voting helping to ameliorate the legal challenges that we're seeing in our electoral processes.
Could I just put one fact on the table and kick it over to Miles? This is, as of a month or so ago from when we're speaking, we are really becoming two Americas when it comes to democracy, because according to the Brennan Center, since the 2020 election, 25 states have actually expanded voting opportunities. They took a look at what happened and said, this is great. We can bring more people in and make it easier still for people to vote. So 25 states on that side and 19 states on the other side that have rolled back voting opportunities. And while the 19 states that rolled it back tend to be red states, tend to be Republican states, there are states like Kentucky and Utah that have actually tried to make it easier to vote in that period. And so, instead of just building together on reforms that made it easier to vote, you've got all these states saying, oh, gee, we didn't like it that so many people went to the polls. And we think that's a bad idea. And to kick it over to Miles, we think universal voting would help push back against that. Why don't you take it from there, Miles, if that's okay?
So to Kara, to get back to the question of how we think that the idea of universal voting is something of an antidote to the voter suppression efforts. I guess I would say two things. One, EJ always uses the term that the best way to protect voting as a right is to assert it as a civic duty for every American. And that is that if we can change the frame of the discussion to the fundamental, just having that as a starting point, the fundamental idea that we want every single person to be participating, I think that starts to change the way different kinds of institutions will look at their responsibilities within democracy. It will change the way election officials think about what they have to do, not so much selecting who is eligible and who isn't, but rather helping everyone to make sure that they can fulfill their civic responsibilities. I think it's fair to say, though, that this is not a magic elixir that somehow if we get the debate going about universal voting, voter suppression will cease. I mean, there is a real and determined effort by, not, by the way, and I think it's important to say, not by the Republican Party as a party, because I know that there are a number of Republican secretaries of the state and other Republican election officials who did really, really good jobs in 2020 of making the system work so that people could in fact vote. But within the party, there are clearly people who are determined to enshrine minority rule by any means necessary, and we can't sugarcoat that at this point. And it has to be fought, in the legislatures, in the courts, through the Justice Department in some situations. But we also don't want to just sort of, be in the frame of defensive posture. I think what EJ hoped to do is put out a North Star of what we really imagine democracy could be, and that is with everyone participating. And I think that will have hopefully a healthy spillover effect into the discussion.
And again, if I could just go back to Australia, and we talked before we went on the podcast about parties and voting. I think what you that is, say, not political parties, but partying, having fun, connecting elections to and making them celebrations rather than dreary 6-hour waits in line. What's really striking is that Australia has created over this 100 years a real ethic and a sense of obligation in the country, but also a sense of celebration whenever elections happen. They have elections on Saturday, which means they can use all the schools in the country as voting places. So they got plenty of voting places. They make it easy to vote other ways too. And mail voting and the like is going up in Australia as well. But because and we don't propose Saturdays in our book, although we do think it's a good idea to make Election Day a national holiday. But by creating that spirit, elections become an occasion for communities to celebrate themselves and come together. At polling places, you can buy all kinds of great stuff to eat because all the school groups in the neighborhood and the civic groups set up stands to raise money for civic and community activities. And Australia is especially famous for their democracy sausages. They joke about having sausage sizzles at the polls. And since I've been talking about democracy sausages, I've gotten a number of emails from Australian friends telling me where they are looking forward to that democracy sausage. The Board of Elections in Australia has a sense of humor. They actually put out a formal looking statement saying that the onion officially should go on top of the democracy sausage. But we want to make very clear to listeners that while we celebrate democracy sausages in our book, we also suggest that there be vegan alternatives. But having Election Day as a party, having Election Day as a shared civic event, and as I said, celebration, really begins to change your attitude toward what elections are about. And the lines are all so short, and that's so important.
And in the best of circumstances, and there's some interesting recent writing about this, that we think that the universal voting could have some impact in increasing the level of trust that people have in the electoral system, and therefore in the government as a whole. There's a very recent article that talked about the differences in part in Australia's response and successfully responding to COVID in comparison to the United States. And one of the factors that was cited most frequently was that people in Australia have more trust in their institutions. And therefore, when there are decrees or instructions or guidances issued, they didn't have the same kind of compliance issues that that the United States has. And again, does universal voting automatically get to that result? Not necessarily, but I think it could have a real impact. If everyone is participating, everybody feels like they've had some say in electing the government that's there, I think that helps to build trust.
Miles is referencing a really great article the New York Times did that compared Australia and us in the United States and its reaction. And, a friend of ours recently called our attention to it and said, obviously you can't create 100% correlation. There are all kinds of differences between us and the Australians, but it is notable what Miles said, that there is a degree of trust, even though that doesn't mean people are happy with their parties. There's a lot of unhappiness in Australia, their political unhappiness. It's not as if they don't have conflict or they don't have moments of alienation. But I think it is a better system that tends to produce better civic outcomes.
So you lean heavily on Australia, but we know also that 24 democratic countries have versions of compulsory participation. Sticking with this Australian case study, can you speak to how exactly universal voting works there?
Yeah, I'll start, and the Secretary of the State can pick it up from there as somebody who actually had to ran in 11 elections and ran some as well. But the Australian system is pretty straightforward. You have to register, but the government makes it easy to register, helps register people. So you have an almost complete voter roll. If you're on the voter roll, you have to vote. When you do vote, you do not have to pick a candidate. One reason we don't call it compulsory voting is because both as a matter of a moral commitment and a legal commitment, you can't force people to choose a candidate on the ballot if they don't want to vote for any of them. So in Australia, you can draw a cartoon character on your ballot. You can cast a blank ballot. You can do whatever you want. You just have to participate. And if your form of protest is to abstain, is to cast an empty ballot, you can do that. We would carry that over into our system. And just to make very clear that voters don't have to pick a candidate, we'd add a none of the above option to every contest. So people could check that, which they now have the states of Nevada and Arizona. Or if you don't vote, if you don't show up or cast a ballot by mail, whatever means you choose, you get a notice from the Australian government saying you didn't vote. Why didn't you vote? If you give any kind of reason, they don't fine you. A legitimate reason like being sick or something like that. Only 13% of non-voters actually pay the fine, which means only about 1%, 1.3% of people overall, something like that, maybe even less than that. So most people don't have to pay the fine. In our system, we would basically take the same thing. It's the fine in Australia is $20 Australian, which is about 15 bucks. We propose, states obviously could do whatever they want to alter the proposal we have in the book. But we propose a fine of no more than $20. We were very aware of, when we organized the working group, we met with all sorts of groups, including civil rights and voting rights groups, immigrant groups, and others, secretaries of state and local election officials. And there's a real concern about what became known as the Ferguson problem of low-income people having fines multiplied and with penalties and interest, and then having them criminalized. So we make very clear that, number one, the $20 fine we propose would not be criminal in nature. Could not be criminalized. Two, it would never be increased with penalties or interests. $20 is $20, period. And in addition to that, we have two other provisions that we hope would answer some of the concerns of our libertarian friends who don't, as some of them have already written against this idea. And we talked with them too, by the way, when we were putting our proposal together in the working group. We provide a conscientious objector status for people. If they really want to stay out of this system, they can. There are some religious groups that have a problem with participating in government at all, but we don't confine it to religious people. If you want to assert a conscientious objector status, you can. And we also give people the option of an hour of community service if they don't want to pay the fine. So that's roughly how the system works. We think of it as at most a nudge and not a shove, and certainly not a hammer. And what we found, and Shane Singh, a great political scientist down at the University of Georgia, who's probably one of the world's greatest experts on compulsory participation systems, what he found in research that we include in the book is that systems with moderate enforcement, like Australia's, do about as well as systems with heavy-handed enforcement. So why do heavy-handed enforcement? We think this system can work well with minimal pressure on the voter, on the citizen. Miles, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, well, that's a pretty good description. But the thing that I want to add to that is that, you can certainly recognize the possibility that imposing or enacting a responsibility of every citizen to vote, if it is overlaid on a kind of suppressive system or badly functioning election system, would be a real problem. So what we do also is support a whole series of gateway reforms, many of the ones that I talked about earlier, whose enactment, again, from same-day registration to or early voting and expanded mail-in voting would make it easier for people to fulfill their obligations. We also strongly support the idea of effective, nonpartisan, and properly funded election administration. I mean, we're seeing the negative consequences of a balkanized and underfunded and unprofessionalized and frankly partisan election system. In Australia, they have a national election commission, and that election commission sets the standards, and they make sure that people have the information that they need. They have the proper funding to do public education work, and so all those things are important. So what we hope is that the discussion of universal voting and the kind of end goal of full participation. By the way, the end goal is not passing fines on people. The end goal is full participation and a culture that shifts towards full participation. And last one I want to make is that I do think that to the degree that people are seriously talking about universal voting, it will help to create a culture shift. So I like to use the example, if I'm a principal at a high school, and I know that every graduating senior is going to be required to vote as a matter of civic duty. Am I going to make civic education a more important part of the curriculum? I think I am. You know what I mean? And I think even if I'm an employer or an institution, and all the employees of that institution or company, have to vote, is it more likely that I would make sure that they have the time off and the ability to do so? Again, I think it would. So I think the idea is that, the institutions of the society, whether it's a state or whether it's a municipality or whether if it were enacted federally, I think would bend towards making this successful. I mean, it would take a lot of work and a lot of time and proper funding, but I think it's a goal worth fighting for.
So Miles, I would love to just kind of follow up on what you've been discussing in terms of getting there. And there's you both talk in the book about gateway reforms that could accompany it, and we see it in many of the states where there's opening up of voting rights. But I also wonder what you see as some of the challenges, especially from your perspective of conducting elections in the state of Connecticut. What do you see as some of the challenges to implementing universal voting at the state and local level? And then maybe EJ, if you could talk a little bit about what you see as some of the challenges at the national level, particularly in this age of partisan polarization.
Well, I was just going to say that the polarization and the paralysis of polarization, is sort of the biggest potential obstacle. I mean, proposing a major election reform, or frankly, any major reform, is a daunting task. People have become used to it the way it is. And in elections, people everybody thinks they're an expert who's in political life because it's their livelihood. So I think that, that will certainly be difficult. We're not naive in thinking that this is going to be an easy lift. But I do think that there are, and EJ will probably cite a little bit of the polling that we did in the book, but there are people who believe that voting is both a right and a duty. We have the analogy that I think is extremely powerful of jury duty, which is every single American citizen is required to serve on a jury if called. Now, why do we do that? And why have we done it for, over 100 years? Because we want the jury pool, the people who are deciding on guilt or innocence of a person and an appropriate punishment, to be fully reflective of the society as a whole and not to be kind of biased or tilted in one direction or another. I think that analogy holds absolutely for voting, which is we should certainly want, that the decisions about how we govern ourselves, the laws that we live by, the people who are going to create those laws should be selected by the fullest possible representation of the society. And I think universal voting gets us there. So I think we're going to find people, we are already finding people who say, gee, I hadn't thought about this before. This is a really intriguing idea. Let's have some discussion about it. We're going to get some attacks. Today, we were happy to see that we were attacked in the New York Post. And so, this is what it means to put an idea on the table. And I think that there's we're not starting from a base where this is an easy lift, but we think we can get there, and we think some real determined work can get us there.
Miles alluded to the polling we did on this with the Democracy Fund and the UCLA's Netscape project. Put some questions on their surveys for us. And I always say that what we included in the book, which says either that Miles and I are two of the most honest book writers ever or two of the dumbest, because our own polling shows that right now, most Americans oppose our idea. 26% favor it, and 64% oppose it. Although the way I look at the numbers, only 48% strongly oppose it, which to me, there are two things about that. One is I was actually pleasantly surprised that for an idea that had never been put forward in any comprehensive way in the public debate, that when we described it, 26% said yes, which I thought was a good place to start. And that if 48% are strongly opposed, then you've got about half the country that's already open to persuasion. And so we think there's an opening here. And then the second point is there's an opening because people agree with our underlying premise that voting is both a right and a duty. Because in the same poll, we asked, is voting a right and a duty, or is it a right but not a duty, or is it neither a right nor a duty? 61% believe it is both a right and a duty. And interestingly, Republicans and Democrats were equally likely to say that it is a right and a duty. And on the proposal itself, we found that Republicans were almost as much for it as Democrats were. We had 33% among Democrats, but we had 29% support among Republicans. Independents were somewhat more skeptical than either Democrats or Republicans. Now, I'll grant you that all this polling was done before former President Trump started his Stop the Steal movement and all of his, I'm just going to be direct about lying propaganda about what actually happened in 2020. And unfortunately, some of that has had an effect on Republican voters. But I think what's good about when we did the polling is that you saw that there were Republicans ready to listen to this idea, and there were Republicans who shared the view that voting is a duty as well as a right. So that we think if we can get past this storm that we're passing through right now, we could get somewhere. I have a particular idea, which I'm going to ask Miles with his organization to try to bring about, which is I would love a Republican state and a Democratic state to try it at the same time. The two I have in mind, because they're small, because they have been open to voters expansions, are Utah and Vermont. They have strong civic traditions in both states. Another path will be to adopt it at the local level. There are 13 states where localities have a lot of freedom to adopt ideas like this, counties or cities or towns, and we'd like to see it tried that way. I'm going to steal Miles's line because I like it so much. He's right when he says there's really a democracy movement in the country. I think there are lots of people who are worried about the state of our democracy, but also have hope of improving it. And so we're hoping this becomes part of the fabric of the democracy movement, where people who are fighting for all kinds of other reforms say, we really should try this one.
Just a quick note, you mentioned Utah, which might actually be a wonderful state to start. They're implementing a lot of ranked choice voting in Utah as well right now. I think over 23 towns and localities in Utah have already implemented ranked choice voting. So there's actually a lot of, for what we might term as a red state, there is a lot of progressive work being done in terms of democratic reforms. Abe, sorry, did you want to ask?
No, I just wanted Miles to add, because he's sort of out there organizing already on this. If he wanted to talk on that.
Well, I think that the other point that's worth making is that you could also imagine this being implemented at the municipal level. There's no question that state legislatures could adopt this, and I think there is real interest. I love EJ's idea, and I think the fact, and there is some synergy, Kara, between people who are fighting for ranked choice voting and people who are for universal voting.
Australia combines them, actually.
Right, right. And it's going to have an election next week. So we'll find out how the two of them did together. Um, but the idea is being that, if everyone is voting, and in fact, everyone's vote is being counted in the way that they mean it to count, in the best way that they mean it to count, which I think ranked choice voting does. That's a pretty good system. Those things go together, I think, fairly nicely. So I think, trying to work it in some states and at the municipal level. But it is worth pointing out that there has been a congressional bill filed, which surprised and delighted us very shortly after the book. Congressman John Larson of Hartford, Connecticut, filed a bill, read the book, thought it was a really good idea, and has filed the Civic Duty to Vote Act, which is in Congress now. And he's working on lining up co-sponsors, hopefully some bipartisan co-sponsors as we speak. So, that's a sign for us that this idea is at least ringing and having some resonance in various places.
Be curious to see if Vermont and Utah were able to pilot this, what other civic outcomes would accompany voting? Going to Miles's earlier point about building a civic culture, what else might we see from places relative to states that do not have it?
It's a good question, an interesting question. And, again, I go back to what EJ said, which is we are not doing this to, win an ideological victory, for either party or for particular ideas. There is some sense, and it makes perfect sense in a way, if you think about it, that when the electorate is fully reflective of the population as a whole, which means that it is more reflective of people who are young, people who are low income, people who who have lesser in the way of degrees, the responsiveness of government to the issues of those people is likely to increase. And there's some evidence that that it does. Again, it's not going to change overnight. And we have many other aspects of our political system, that have impact here, which would not be changed by universal voting. So the issues around money in politics and the outrageous sums of money that are being put into politics, even narrowing up the pyramid so that you've got ultra billionaires kind of staking whole elections. You still have the Electoral College, doesn't change by universal voting. You still have the undemocratic nature of the Senate itself. So there are a lot of things that our democracy needs work on. But in the lane, it seems to me, of getting people to participate, getting people to own the decisions more, getting people to think of themselves as civic actors in a way that they don't now. I think universal voting will have a very, very salutary impact on those aspects of our culture.
And would we see more letters to the editor, heightened political discourse, more engagement in other forms of political and civic activity between election cycles?
Well, two other things I think this would do is it would almost certainly produce I won't even say moderate, because I don't think that's quite the right word, but a less ideological electorate. There is evidence, and it shouldn't surprise us, that the non-voters on the whole tend to be less ideological in their approach to issues, to candidates, to elections than people who actually vote. As Miles likes to say, a lot of our campaigns are based on enraged to engage. And we're certainly seeing that already in 2022 and with some great cost. And so I think that including voters who are less ideological actually has a positive effect on the system. I have a Republican friend who's been involved in Republican and quite conservative politics for a long time, who actually is for this system. I want him to come out and endorse it because he thinks it would make it easier for the Republican Party to moderate itself. And he's not a squishy, liberal Republican. He's a conservative, but he thinks the party has gone off the rails in the Trumpian direction. And I think there's evidence that the voters this would bring in would be somewhat more moderate. And then I also think, especially in tandem with ranked choice voting, which we write favorably about, although that's not what we are advancing in the book, just to be clear. I think that creates some pressure on campaigns to be more inclusive in their messaging and perhaps somewhat less harsh because of the nature of the voters who will be coming in and the nature of the voters they're trying to bring in. And obviously ranked choice has that effect because if you can't get a number one from a voter, you would like a number two. And again, it's not, none of this is an elixir. I'm a sociologist, so I think that, a lot of our political discontent is rooted in social factors. So I don't pretend that institutional change alone fixes everything, but I do believe that institutions can shape behavior. And I think this one would have a lot of effects that we could use right about now.
You know,
Oh, go ahead.
just to kind of draw out EJ's point even a little more, which is one of the things that would change is the nature of campaigning. Right now, the currency of the realm, in addition to currency, is whether you can turn out your vote. All the Democratic consultants and all the Republican consultants are busy telling their candidates now, this is not a persuasion election in 2022. This is a turnout election. If we can get on the Democratic side, I happen to hear this more, the level of participation that we had in 2018 will win. The Democrats will win. So all we need to do, we don't need to persuade undecided voters. We need to get our base out. And of course, if ditto on the Republican side. And of course, then you have in the worser case scenarios, how can we try to prevent people on the other side from voting so that way we win then? But if everybody is going to vote, or 90% of the people are going to vote, and everybody is listening all the time, you really can't do that. The incentive structure changes. You really have to talk to everybody. Campaigns will become more about persuasion, less about turnout. I think, as EJ says, that would make for a slightly less kind of polarized and ideological electorate. And, and the other thing is it would invite many more people into the system. I tell the story all the time. I ran in 11 elections, as EJ said. I hated raising money, but I did it because I had to. But I loved knocking on doors. But I was given a list at the beginning of a night of registered voters, and that registered voter list would be highlighted. And the highlights were for people who were what we called prime voters. And basically what the candidate, the campaign team, all of whom were friends of mine, said is, don't waste your time on people who are not prime voters. So if you see people sitting on a stoop and they're not on that list, as Dionne Warwick would say, walk on by, just don't engage them because they can't help you. And that's a terrible thing for, So if I know that all those people are elected, I'm going to stop, I'm going to talk to everybody, and everybody's going to feel invited into the process.
And we have done about 36 events together now on this. And I always say at the end of that little spiel that it's the only thing Miles says during our talks that I don't fully believe, because knowing Miles, I know he probably stopped and talked to them anyway and had to be dragged away by his campaign consultants. But his point is the right one, which is that a lot of people, and it really goes back to where we started, we are just not inviting a lot of people into the system. And we think it takes a reform, a big reform like this one, to change a whole series of behaviors in what we think is a more democratic and more inclusive process with a minimum of coercion, because this is not a heavy-handed form of coercion. At most you pay a fine of $20. And I think that that's worth it. And again, we ask people to do a lot of things in the society bylaw. As Miles said, we have jury duty, and Charles Ogletree, the great civil rights lawyer, said that the jury gives ordinary people extraordinary power. Elections give ordinary people extraordinary power. We require parents to educate their kids, usually in school, although some can homeschool under certain circumstances, until at least the age of 16. That's a very serious demand. And then we obviously have other kinds of regulations in our lives, like we have to wear seatbelts, which is not only designed to protect us, but it saves our medical system and thus all of us a whole lot of money. So there are things that we require in the public interest that when citizens agree to them, they are collectively better off. And we think this is a case where we would be collectively better off for this very small obligation, which again, we want to make as easy as possible. And it would be far easier than having to serve on a jury for a long trial. And that's for sure.
I think one of the things you also point out in the book, to go back to the case of Australia, is that it's not just the parties that are then mobilizing the electorate. It's civic organizations, it's the government, it's a whole range of actors that then get involved with, in schools and universities. There's greater stakes for other sectors of society to be involved in the electoral process, not just the parties. I also wanted to get your take, though, on how this might work with our current primary system, because what we know with the state of primaries is that we now have, non-competitive we're at the highest level of non-competitive congressional districts. In 2020, only 23 million of America's 235 million voters effectively elected 83% of Congress. So a small number of people are essentially choosing the candidates in these primary elections. And this is really contributing to many of the problems that we're seeing in the types of candidates. We saw, for example, former President Donald Trump talking about primarying out people, and we see him doing this right now in this election year, who don't buy into the big lie. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on how universal voting would work if we don't reform, or how can it work in also reforming the primary system?
Right. Well, it's a very, very good question, Karen, and not an easy one. Let me come at it from a little bit sideways, which is that one question is, what elections, in a larger sense, what elections should this apply to? And the United States has a lot more elections than most other countries, and that's a complicating factor in and of itself. We have school board elections and town council elections and water authority board elections, et cetera. And so, we generally think that one of the things that may happen, would be helpful to happen, is some consolidation of elections, so people don't have to go out as many times. And obviously, if legislators are drafting a bill, they will have to figure out, what elections it should apply to. We did talk about the specific issue of primaries, and our recommendation is that this not be applied to primaries. Partly because in a theoretical way, they are party affairs. They are decision making within a political party, and kind of compelling someone to be to vote in a party primary is a more complicated question, I think. So our recommendation has been not to include primaries, but I do think that to the degree that universal voting ups the number of people who are participating at all. Some party primaries are closed primaries, some are open, some are first past the post, some have ranked choice voting. They're changing now. But I think the trend towards more open primaries, more participation, would, I think, in general, be a healthy one.
Yeah, I do think that by creating the bigger general election electorate, it would put on the minds of the primary voters the need to pick candidates who can prevail in that larger electorate. Now, that doesn't get around gerrymandering, which we have to do something about. I got to say, my own feeling on that discussion, which is not related directly to the proposal in the book, is I think I am torn between two sort of broad ideas, which is, on the one hand, I want parties to pick mainstream candidates who appeal beyond just the very, very core base. I see advantages to that. But I also think parties are very important. I think we underplay the role of parties as essential to democracy. If we got rid of parties today, they would form in about 2 weeks, different names, but we would organize ourselves, because parties are a way of people organizing themselves to have influence on government and take power. The system I've been partial to, maybe because it's the one I grew up with in Massachusetts, is a party primary system that allows independents to pick up a ballot in either party on primary day. And they can switch their registrations back to independent if they want. In New Hampshire, where they had this system, you can actually switch right at the polling place and go back to being independent. So it creates a kind of semi-open primary because I think California has sort of this system which in general elections can give you a Democrat running against a Democrat or a Republican running against a Republican. And some people argue, well, that creates some benefit for maybe the more moderate Republican or more moderate Democrat, but it actually disenfranchises a lot of voters who may not vote in the primary and wanted to go out and vote for a Republican or a Democrat in the general election. So I think that all our debates about this should be tempered by wanting a more broadly open system on the one side, but understanding that every democratic system needs some sort of party system to function, if I may say so, democratically and in a representative way. And I think that's the struggle we have.
We are getting close to the end of our time, and I hope that you don't mind. We have one more question that we would love for you to address, and we're so grateful for the time that you've spent with us on Democracy Matters and for your attention to the topic of strengthening democracy. What's next? How are you hoping to move this idea forward?
Well, I think we are very happy with the way the book has been received and believe in the power of the written word. But we also believe that there is power in organizing. So I think what we are hoping to do is to create a kind of an organized initiative that will kind of, operate, I would say, in three big strategies. One is to continue, as we've tried to do with the book, to put this idea out into public debate. I mean, we're happy when the New York Post editorial board or columnist criticizes us, because it means that the conversation is beginning. We're putting this on the table and people are responding, and that's important. So we'd love to see it discussed on college campuses. We're hoping that maybe some political science professors will assign the book to their classes. That would be a great thing. But on the one level, sort of continuing the idea discussion. The second level, and EJ referred to the democracy movement, is that that many of these organizations are working on, one issue or another within the voting field. We'd like to put this as part of the suite of policies that the democracy movement supports, not to supplant work on automatic voter registration or ranked choice voting or same-day registration or restoration of voting rights to formerly incarcerated people. All those things are really, really important to do, but we'd also like one plank, so to speak, to be the idea that we are really moving towards universal voting. And then I'm hoping that in 2023 or 2024, depending on how it is, that in some states and some municipalities, legislators or city councilors will say, this is worth taking a risk. This is worth going a little bit against the grain of what people have been thinking about up until now. And let's have some political debate. I mean, we did have actually a public hearing in the state of Massachusetts on a bill that was filed for universal voting. There was a bill filed in Connecticut that we actually have put in the book by a very special state legislator there. Anyway, so those are the three prongs to try to keep it moving in the idea world, to get the democracy movement to pick up the cudgel, so to speak, and then to hopefully see it in public policy debate, starting next year. I'll be happy.
Miles's kind reference there was to a former student of mine, State Senator Will Haskell, who actually introduced the bill in Connecticut. And his bill is an appendix in our book where we just want to show this can be done. Here's one way a legislator did it. And what I can add to what Miles said are just two things. One is we include in the book Abraham Lincoln's quote about we must disenthrall ourselves and we must think anew and act anew under these circumstances. And I do think that because we live in a moment where lots of people are deeply concerned about the long-term health of democracy, see threats to democracy itself, and want to fight back against it, but in the process are also discovering the value of and importance of democracy. We think there is an opening for new ideas, for people to take steps they might not have thought about 5 or 10 years ago to make democracy stronger, more inclusive, and to get past this mess we're in. The other thing I always like to point out, because we talk about Australia a lot, is that there are ideas that seem terribly radical when they are first proposed and then are taken for granted once they're adopted. I mean, you can go all the way back. Voting used to be limited to white men with property. We would never imagine a system that did that would be democratic. But there's something we take for granted every election, which is the secret ballot. The secret ballot was not the way we did elections for much of our history. And as it happens, there was a country called Australia that pioneered the secret ballot. And it was known for many, many years as the Australian ballot. And this idea came to America as we proposed to bring universal voting to America. And there was a fierce debate about it across the country in the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s. Jill Lepore, the great historian up at Harvard, wrote a lovely piece about it in the New Yorker. And people thought it was a terrible idea. Machine politicians sure didn't like it because if they bought votes with the old system, they actually knew somebody had voted the way they said they would for the $5 or whatever they gave them. But a lot of people didn't like it. No, people should declare themselves in the open. And within 30 years, everybody was using the secret ballot. We took one good idea from Australia and made it an integral part of our system. I think this is an idea where if we adopt it, we will over time appreciate it the way the Australians do. My favorite picture of voting in Australia photo is of 4 surfers in their wetsuits standing in the voting booth with their surfboards leaned up to the side of the voting booth, casting their ballots. They clearly jumped out of the surf, cast their votes, and jumped right back in. That is a country that values voting, understands and accepts its importance. And if you add the idea that maybe we could all become good surfers in the process, that would be kind of fun. But we hope that people come to see this as a way of making our democracy better, more inclusive, and less prone to cycles of exclusion.
Miles Rapoport and E.J. Dionne, co-authors of 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. Thank you so much for joining us on Democracy Matters.
Thanks so much for having us. This was great fun.
Indeed, enjoyed it very much.